Yeah, so that was
It must have been just like it came and it was just, I've only been paper maybe.
because his book exactly. Okay, so
And he didn't have they were falling. Chester is like now he's
yeah, no, he's great.
I'm just like, oh God, what a disaster.
I remember that, and 20 years ago, and he insisted on just doing music, and it was pretty good.
Yeah.
In his defense, it's still pretty new, like having good PowerPoint like that. But I just remember from the school, having the acetate,
and they were sliding off the slippery, and he just like, oh no.
Was the year this
It was in just the other part of the store. The store is this bad that people were classy.
Oh,
Since then,
oh, for sure, yeah.
And then the most recent, I saw 3 blocks of change. I saw the fever hair blowing in the wind. And so we walked towards China. And then we couldn't find it. It was
Wait, so this was was this for his recent book, Mary West?
it must have been like 4 years ago, before the pandemic.
That was 2016.
Yeah.
So that was,
And then I came to find it in the store.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Oh, I need to turn this on.
yeah.
Okay, nice. We're ready to go. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mylène. I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Bookseller itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're gathered here tonight to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Are You Willing to Die for the Cause? Revolution in the 1960s Quebec by Chris Oliveros. We'd like to thank Drawn Quarterly for both publishing this book and for all their assistance in helping make tonight happen. Just a few quick procedural details before we get started. The author will be introduced and then he will speak on the book. Following the presentation, there will be a conversation hosted by Candida Rifkind. After the conversation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So if you do have a question, I'll be out here with the handheld microphone. So please just raise your hand, I will come to see you. That way the people who are streaming live from home can hear you clearly. And afterwards, we'll be doing a signing. And so once we finish the event, we will transport Chris over to his signing table. So we ask you to remain seated for a few moments while he sets up there. Tonight, your host, Candida Rifkind, is a professor in the Department of English Literature at the University of Winnipeg, where she researches and teaches comics and Canadian literature. She has published widely on the Canadian and international comics and graphic novels and served as president of the Comics Studies Society. She is currently writing about autobiographical Canadian comics and co-writing a book on global refugee comics, and she helps to maintain the online Indigenous comics annotated bibliography. Our special guest this evening, Chris Oliveros, was born in 1966 in Montreal and grew up in the nearby suburb of Chaminade-Laval. He founded Drawn Quarterly in 1989 and was the publisher for the following 25 years. Oliveros stepped down from D&Q in 2015 to work on this book about the early years of the Front de Libération de Québec. Please join me in welcoming Chris Oliveros.
Thank you very much, Milan, and thank you, McNally Robinson, for hosting this event. And thank you, Candida, for being here for the conversation following this. So as Milan mentioned, I will be giving a talk on this new book that just came out called Are You Willing to Die for the Cause? It's a book on the FLQ. And when I had the idea to do a book on this subject, my first idea was, it seemed obvious that it was going to be about the October crisis, because that's the best known period of the FLQ. There was the kidnappings, the death of a Quebec politician, the War Measures Act, even Pierre Trudeau's most famous line, probably his most famous line, just watch me. It all comes from that period. So I started by researching what came before then. I was thinking maybe this is probably going to be a prologue of sorts of what happened before then, 10, 20 pages. As soon as I was doing research, I became flabbergasted by what I was discovering. So many details were not known, or were just known on the surface. And then within a week of starting that research, I realized, no, this is it. The book has to be on this earlier period in the 1960s. That other book on the October crisis, that's going to be it, book 2. So it all started over here with this man over here. His name was Georges Shooters. He was a recently arrived immigrant from Belgium who arrived in Quebec. He had set up in Quebec for a few years. And he was the principal founder of the first wave of the FLQ. But today, he is almost completely unknown. So unknown was he when he died. He died in 1994. He took his own life. That when he died, there was no coverage whatsoever in the media. No newspapers, no television, radio. There was nothing. The only official recognition of his death was in this 45-word paid notice in French, put in a French newspaper, announcing the memorial. So a few of his friends got together, paid, probably $20 or whatever to put this notice in the paper. And to give you an idea of how insignificant this was, you see over here, you have a large newspaper and there's a tiny mark in yellow. Well, that was the size of this paid notice, completely ignored by everyone. Now, the reason why I have these two photos over here is because without Fidel Castro, this is Fidel Castro on the right. Without Fidel Castro, there may never have been an FLQ. On the left, that's Georges Shooters, and I didn't realized that they both had met. I knew that Fidel Castro had an enormous influence on the wave of 1960s revolutionary movements, but I didn't know that Georges Shooters and Fidel Castro met in Montreal. This just weeks after the Cuban Revolution. So Castro invited Shooters to visit Cuba as a guest of Castro, and Shooters also met Che Guevara while he was there. Now, Shooters was determined to follow in the footsteps of Castro, and it was with Quebec that Shooters would find the place that was ripe for revolution, because the Quebec in the early 1960s, at the end of the period known as the Great Darkness, just as the Quiet Revolution was starting, it was a terrible period for Francophones. I mean, Francophones, to give you one statistic, they were earning something like half the amount of their Anglophone counterparts. The education system was just, up until that point, it was run by the Catholic Church. They had basically shut the door for higher education for Francophones. Less than 10% of Francophones had access to universities. So Georges Shooters wanted to overturn the system through a revolution. And he started with Molotov cocktails, and that went on to dynamite. Now, I thought that those early days of his planning with the FLQ, I thought that was undocumented because no books had covered it, no newspapers had covered it, or so I thought. But then I actually stumbled across a major article about this about those early days. It turns out that his wife, Jeanne Shooters, was interviewed for a major magazine article, and the article was written in the first person, so it's like her talking, her describing everything. So she was there when he was making those Molotov cocktails in their apartment in a working class neighborhood of Montreal. And she was there when he started hauling in the crates of dynamite to be put in the kitchen cupboard next to the boxes of their children's cereal. And that's the other thing. They weren't just a couple, they had two kids. They had a baby and a little girl. So all this was going on while their kids slept in the next room. And she was there when the first meetings of the FLQ were held, where they wrote their first manifesto, and where they came up with terms like the suicide commandos of the FLQ. All that was described in this article. But so I was trying to think, why was this article forgotten? Why has no one referenced this article in 60 years? So then this is a spread of the article, just to give you an idea. I helped the FLQ terrorists because I loved my husband. There's some fantastic quotes in this article. I was thinking, how could this have gone ignored for all this time? So then I took a closer look at it. I looked at the date. Now, if this date sounds familiar to you, it's because it was the day after the JFK assassination. So this magazine, Weekend Magazine, it used to be, it was a Saturday supplement to the newspaper. So this is the Montreal Star, but it was actually distributed all across Canada, probably here in Winnipeg as well, and I know in Vancouver. So when people got their Saturday newspaper, it says, you see where it says Weekend at the top? Weekend refers to the magazine with the article on Jeanne Shooters. Nobody would have been reading that article on Jeanne Shooters because everyone would have been reading what happened with JFK. But the article was so long that it actually had to be split in two. So 7 days later, that was part two. So maybe people could have caught up, right? But I think probably people were still reading about what happened with JFK. But I just wanted to make sure that nothing else happened like a week later to distract people's attention again. So I did my due diligence, I checked what happened. And then, so again, a week later, the Friday before, that article came out, another disaster happened in Canada, the worst airplane disaster in Canadian history up until that point. A plane just took off from the Montreal airport and crashed a few minutes north of Montreal, killing over 100 people. So again, 1 week after another, everyone's attention would have been on this disaster. Nobody would have been reading that article on Jeanne Shooters. So it was lost to history. This is a bit of a stark contrast. This over here is a well-known restaurant in Montreal called Da Giovanni. It actually still exists today. The reason why I have this photo is because, believe it or not, this was the site of the FLQ recruitment drive. They actually had a recruitment drive because they started off as three members, three guys, and they needed help in for throwing Molotov cocktails and making bombs and so on. So what they did is they actually had a survey with 10 questions. Do you have access to firearms? Do you have a secret hideout? And my favorite question, are you willing to die for the cause? And they were all yes and no questions. So what they would do is they would summon potential recruits to Da Giovanni. And here's a photo from the interior. And they would be sitting, the three guys would be sitting at one of the booths here. the recruit would come up to them, they would hand him the survey, he would go to another booth to, you know, check off each question. Now, if the recruit answered yes to most, preferably all the questions, he was in, he would be hired. I mean, he would be part of the group, there was no salary. So from this recruitment drive, they set up a 19-year-old guy in this motel on the outskirts of Montreal. And his mission was to build bombs because they had something called Operation Westmount. And what Operation Westmount was, is that they were going to put bombs in 10 different mailboxes in Westmount, which is and is the richest neighborhood in Montreal. And Westmount was a very important target because Westmount was sort of the symbol of the colonizers, the symbol, of course, the Anglophone elite that the FLQ wanted to overthrow. So the one other problem about this 19-year-old, he actually did not have a whole lot of experience making bombs. The only thing he knew about bomb making was what he learned in grade 7 in middle school. In the book I write in high school, but in Quebec, grade 7 is high school, but everywhere else in Canada, grade 7 is middle school. So he had almost no experience whatsoever. The other thing too, is that the FLQ had one car, a Volkswagen Beetle. They were going to drive from the other side of town to get to Westmount to drop off the bombs. For some reason, there was no room for this 19-year-old in the car. So they took half of the bombs. They left him with the other 5 bombs. He had to make his way to the other side of town, taking public transportation in the middle of the night. Luckily, nothing went wrong. It all, you know, yeah, it's, you know, no disaster happened yet. So the following morning, the police were, you know, blowing up the bombs and dismantling them. This is a then and now photo. This is 1963 on the left, and on the color photo is earlier this summer, almost exactly 60 years later. So the police tasked an army engineer to try to dismantle each bomb. And as you can see, he had no tools. He was doing this with his bare hands. He appears to have some sort of cloth to take out the bombs. Now that worked the first couple of times. Unfortunately, by the time he got to the 3rd bomb, while he was taking out the bomb, it exploded in his bare hands. Remarkably, he was not killed, but he was terribly, terribly wounded, and he went on to live almost another 30 years. Shortly thereafter, the FLQ were rounded up and they were put in jail. But a new wave, a second wave of the FLQ emerged by a completely different group of people. This person over here was also an immigrant, except he was from Hungary. He was also a recently arrived immigrant. His name was François Sherm, also not very well known at all. And he also wanted to start a revolution. He had some army background, and because he had army background, he wanted to essentially create his own army. And so he set up, or tried to set up, a guerrilla army training camp deep in the woods, not far from Montreal. He wanted to get hundreds of soldiers for his training camp. Unfortunately for him, all he could muster was something like a dozen guys. So he had barely any food, barely any equipment, and no weapons. So because they had no weapons, he came up with an idea to rob a gun store, because that's where all the weapons are. So they drove their car to rob this gun store, and the intent was to load up the trunk with guns and rifles. Now, as you might imagine, by a poorly trained group of people doing this, things didn't go very well. 2 store employees were shot and killed by accident. One by the FLQ group, the other one by the police, because they thought that the store employee who picked up a gun to sort of chase the FLQ, they thought he was the robber, so the police shot him. And so François Sherm was arrested. He was actually sentenced to death, because in Canada there was still a death penalty at the time. About a year later, the death penalty was overturned in Canada, and then he was resentenced to life in prison. But that was it. That was the end for that wave of the FLQ. The third wave of the FLQ was run in part by probably the best known and most controversial figure of the FLQ, Pierre Valliere. He's had such an remarkable life, and again, very controversial, but I'll just be focusing on his role in the FLQ in this presentation. So one thing I also didn't know is that he, just before starting the FLQ, he really focused a lot on workers' rights. So he spent an entire year at this shoe factory in Montreal. This is another then and now photo in 1965 and then earlier this summer. So he was on the picket lines trying to, get better working conditions for these workers. He didn't use any weapons at that time. He did actually get into some scuffles with the police. And that's another then and now photo. That's on the right is the same corner of the building as it appears today. But after an entire year of doing this, he was getting nowhere. The factory was still on strike. So he decided that the best way to affect change was to start his own group at the FLQ. So their idea, the first thing they did when they started their group is they recruited a 16-year-old high schooler to drop off a bomb inside this shoe factory. One thing about the FLQ is that, I know it seems odd to think about this, but their intent was actually not to kill people, even though they were using bombs and weapons. With the shoe factory, after they dropped off the bomb, they went to a payphone and called the owner of the factory, and they said, "You've got 5 minutes to evacuate because the bomb is about to go off." Unfortunately, the shoe factory owner thought it was a prank call. He hung up the phone, and 5 minutes later, the bomb exploded, killing a woman working in the factory and injuring many others. That high schooler did this during his lunch hour. He finished one class, he had his lunch hour, he was picked up, dropped off to the bomb, came back to his school a few blocks away without knowing that the tragedy that had happened. He was not aware of it because he thought that they just evacuated the factory. Now, remarkably, this version of the FLQ did not end here. They actually had another idea to bomb another factory. This time they thought they were going to get it right. They were going to learn from their mistakes. So they chose this other factory, Dominion Textile, in another working class neighborhood of Montreal. It's a massive factory. I first went there in the wintertime to sort of scout out the area because I was just before I was going to draw this chapter. I was looking for the area where this incident happened. I couldn't find it, maybe because there was snow on the ground, things looked different in the snow. So I did manage to wait until the summer. I returned in the summer. And then I found this corner of this building. And as I got a little closer, I noticed this very strange white splotch, which you can see on the bottom right of this photo. And then I got a little closer and I thought, oh my God, they couldn't have. No, they didn't do that. So there was one thing I didn't mention. They actually recruited another 16-year-old to drop off another bomb at this factory, another 16-year-old from a different high school. So as he approached this corner of the building, he was taking the bomb out of his bag and the bomb exploded, killing him instantly. So that odd looking white splotch is essentially the silhouette of what remained of his body, because his arms and his legs were blown off by the force of the explosion. So essentially that's a symbol of the silhouette of his torso. And for some reason, one reason or another, the building, the condo board, because it's condos now, that's no longer a factory, decided that they were going to commemorate that time when a poor teenage boy was got himself blown up. Immediately, no, the very next day after that happened, Pierre Valliere and another FLQ member, Charles Gagnon, fled the country. They went to New York and they were there for a couple months. They decided to have a hunger strike in front of the United Nations to draw the world's attention to the Quebec political situation. Once they came out into the open, they were immediately arrested by the police, which then put an end to this version of the FLQ. So thank you very much, and I will now be having a conversation with Candida Rifkind.
Was on this chair. Oh. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to be here. And Chris, that was just fantastic. Your infectious energy and enthusiasm for this story, it's there on the pages as well. So I first want to congratulate you on this book and the amount of research and work that went into everything even before you started the drawing. So we'll talk about making a comic in a bit, but I want to say it's an important story. And I think you've explained to us that these are elements that have been forgotten or lost, sometimes just for the circumstance of time or the news cycle. But it's also a delightful story, which sounds odd to say for such a serious series of events where people lost their lives. But I think we can tell from the way you talk about it that it's almost baffling how these things unfolded. And there's an absurdity to quite a lot of the events. And I was wondering if that is what you're trying to get across here.
Yeah, sorry, I have some mic trouble. It just sort of collapsed a bit over here. Oh, this one there. Okay, great, thank you. Okay. All right, thanks so much. Yeah, that's to me as you said, like just doing the research, that was a consistent element of the entire story, the absurdity of the whole thing. And if there's one thing that linked, there was many things that obviously that linked these groups together. It was the bumbling aspect. One thing was the bumbling aspect. Like time after time after time, they would just do these like dumb mistakes. And or just poor judgment. Like storing crates of dynamite next to where your little daughter is sleeping, your little baby son. Or at the end, like recruiting 16-year-olds to drop off bombs. And I was flabbergasted that so much of this went on. And again, so much of it, and also kind of surprised that very little attention was drawn to that by the media over the years.
So when you were doing your research and going back through the press from this period, did people at the time think that they were actually much more organized and much more threatening than you've since realized they were?
Yeah, you mean to the public at the time?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think because it was never really known how many members there were, or like when each group would start, sometimes people, including the police, would think there were like hundreds of members. But each time they were rounded up, they always discovered that there was really at most like a dozen. And that goes right up until 1970, until the October crisis, where the government at one point said that there was potentially 3,000 members of the FLQ. There really were never more than a couple dozen.
And is it your sense that each wave was independent, or were they communicating with each other? Because it seems, again, absurd that for the first two waves, immigrant men arrive and take up a cause that is not sort of their own cultural cause. But were they communicating with each other, or were they truly independent groups?
And that's the other remarkable thing. So you'd think that there would be at least some kind of communication. Like, what are the odds of starting a group like this, and then having other people that you don't know like taking the torch and creating their own group. Like that's essentially what happened because often there would be like a whole year would go by. So George Shooters, he would get thrown in jail, but then Francois Sherm, that was like 12 months later. I don't even think they ever met. So again, they're always independent of each other.
Okay, and so when you came to outline the story and figure out how you're going to take all of this interesting material, you do organize it by the 3 waves, right? So
yes.
Can you tell us about that process of, spending, well, how long did you spend on the research?
Well, it's hard to say. In the book in total, it was about 6 years. So a good chunk of that was research and then writing it and drawing it and then editing it, and I just threw out a lot of material and redid a lot of material. So I'm not sure exactly how much because the research, there was obviously a lot in the beginning, but it didn't sort of end there because it sort of just continued throughout. And then sometimes even like 2 or 3 years into the project, I would actually find something new, and sometimes new books would be published as I was working on this.
Oh, that's really annoying when that happens.
Well, yeah, in this case, sometimes it could be like if they take your story and so on. But in this case, like there was a fantastic book published in French on Pierre Valliere, and so there was some details I got from that. And then not too long ago, there was a great CBC podcast on this in 2020. So there's a few things, like mostly in the notes section, because I was mostly finished this book by then, but I do cite that podcast a few times in the notes section. Yeah,
and I was going to tell you, if you haven't looked at the book yet, there is a fantastic set of resources at the end. But so I'm wondering how you made the decisions you had to make to tell the story like this. Like you have to leave things out, you have to structure it. You structure it with the 3 waves around 3 main characters. But can you tell us about maybe what you left behind or other choices you could have made?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing, like I said, the 1960s period hasn't been covered very, very much. But I would say that when it has been covered, there is like one major book in French that most people cite. There's a very good 2018 book by Darcy Jenish that was published in English. First English book published in 50 years on this. And like I said, the CBC podcast. I do find that whenever it has been covered, it's just packed with so much information, and it's like I can make sense of it because I've researched it, but I think for the average reader, it would sort of be hard to make heads or tails. Because so for me, what I did is I wanted to focus on the important people. Like to me, the life of George Shooters was fascinating. So the minor characters, and some of them were truly minor. They really were only there for a day or even a week. I might even have them in a panel, but I sometimes don't even reference their names because they weren't that significant. To me, someone like George Shooters, what happened in his apartment and what Jean Shooters saw in that apartment, that was the beginning of the FLQ.
It's so interesting too, because it's so domestic, and that's the incongruence of it too. And then although it was men primarily who were involved, it's really her testimony that gives you a lot of insight, right?
Yeah, absolutely, because I would say that article, or 2 articles, there were 2 articles, I consider it like possibly the most important document on the FLQ, on any period of the FLQ, because it's the beginnings, and it's a first person account of someone who was right there.
We should mention she divorced him.
Yes, she divorced him after that.
So the way the book is structured, you kind of invent a structure for it by claiming that there was a planned CBC series that was going to cover this, and it got expanded, but then all the recordings with the original actors disappeared until they were found in the basement of a retired CBC employee. Now that's not true, is it?
No, so essentially the narrative device of the book is that it's told through a series of first person accounts. And the reason why I have that approach is because to me that seems like the natural way of telling history, because for example, if an incident happens here and we're all witnesses to this incident, I think most people here would sort of describe it in the same way. But you might get different points of view or different opinions. So one person might think whatever this I don't know if there was a fight or something. They might have an opinion. And there might be some contradictory elements. And so that's what I wanted to do with this. And I wanted to be very careful about not using any false information. So that whenever there are contradictions, they just tend to be like points of view rather than like what actually happened.
I actually wanted to ask about that because surely there are different versions of very specific events, but you have to pick a way to draw it and tell your readers what happened. So are there any scenes in particular where you had to make some decisions about what had happened in your mind in order to tell the story?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, like, for example, there'll be the very first action of the FLQ with Molotov cocktails. You have two, possible unreliable narrators. The first one is Jean Drapeau, the mayor of Montreal at the time, and he tended to exaggerate things. So in his account, the FLQ used bombs and destroyed this entire street. But then you have George Shooters who says that actually they just used Molotov cocktails and they couldn't even get the match to light up. So essentially, what happened was true. There was an attack on Drummond Street and that block of Drummond Street. But again, Jean Drapeau's account was a little bit more exaggerated, shall we say.
And you do have him speaking to us. So there's a kind of cinematic quality to the book as well, the way that we have people addressing us as though they're talking heads, and then we go into the action as well, and we see that. So I think you're combining some really interesting kind of genres, because partly it's kind of a caper tale, each section, or like a heist tale that it's about the FLQ, and then you also have the kind of documentary style too. So I really like the way that you blur those different, quite familiar genres to us to tell a new story. So I wanted to ask about the endnotes, because like a very good researcher, and if this was an academic project, you'd get, A+. Not only do you have a bibliography, but you have quite extensive endnotes written in prose, not in comics, telling us different things and expanding, but also telling us sometimes when you've taken creative license, you've compressed a story or you've collapsed two characters. And I wanted to ask why you included those endnotes.
The endnotes in general?
Yeah.
Well, I think because of the fact that it's an important story in Quebec history, in Canadian history, but in particular in Quebec, I wanted to make sure that everything was backed up, especially because of the sort of the absurd aspect of so much of what's going on in this book. I think that if you just came to this book without knowing anything and just started reading it, you probably would think I'm possibly making things up or at least exaggerating things. So what I wanted to do with the endnotes was back everything up just to show that no, this actually really happened. And what I also tried to do is I tried to get as many different sources as possible. So definitely, obviously in French and English. Certainly this couldn't have been done only in English. Most of the material, probably at least 65-70% of the material is only in French. So I use all the daily newspapers from that era in French and English, every possible book that was published, coroners, inquests, and so on. And so when I cite something, I at least try to cite like more than one source.
So I want to ask about audience and also about French and English, but who do you imagine as the ideal readers for this book? People who know the story, or maybe a younger generation, or people from outside Quebec who maybe are unfamiliar with it? Who are you trying to reach, do you think?
That's a good question. And because when you're in the middle of doing the book, when I was doing the book, I wasn't really thinking about that. I was just thinking about the book that I wanted to tell. But of course, now that the book is out, I should be thinking more about that. I mean, my hope is that anyone interested in this history at all, people interested in comics, people interested in this history, And the thing is that I know people in the rest of Canada, like outside of Quebec, might just think that this is like a Quebec story, that everyone in Quebec knows about this. But the remarkable thing is that actually most of this is unknown in Quebec as well, not just by Anglophones, but Francophones as well. Like it really is like mostly a lost history amongst most people in Quebec.
That's interesting. And so related to that, as far as I know, this is the first Canadian, I'll just call it a comic book, graphic history, to be simultaneously released in French and English, because the book launch in Montreal about 3 weeks ago was held in French first at a French bookstore for the French edition, and then for the English one. Usually there's a delay, and it comes out in the artist's first language, and then it takes a year or more to be translated. So why did you want it to be released simultaneously in French and English?
It was really important for me because it's such an important story in Quebec. So I've lived almost my entire life in Quebec. I'm an Anglophone, obviously, and it could have been a little tricky. Probably it would have been problematic if I released a book on this subject in Quebec only in English. So it was really important to have the French edition out. So I delayed the English edition by at least a year so that the two could be timed together. And it was literally published on the same day with, as you said, the launches like back to back, one night after the other.
Was that painful to wait when you knew the English edition could be out there in the world?
Well, I knew it was for the better. It was for the better. Yeah.
Okay. I want to ask about it being a comic as well. So you founded D&Q, Drawn and Quarterly, Canada's leading and groundbreaking publisher of Canadian and international comics artists, we should say. And then you stepped back from publishing to work your first book, The Envelope Manufacturer, and now this one. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the challenges of drawing it as a comic, and whether do you write a script first, you write it out in words and then draw it, and you know, as a comic you obviously have to get the visual things right. So we saw that Chris went to buildings where things happened, and I assume you were sketching or taking photos to get it right. So what are the additional challenges with turning that research into a comic story?
You know, comic stories are really, there's really big challenges, because at least if you're writing a novel, I'm not saying writing a novel is easy, I'm sure it's, you know, very challenging as well, but at least it's easy to make changes, relatively easy, because you could just remove things and add things and so on. With comics, sometimes in my case at least, I sometimes would draw an entire chapter, pages and pages and pages of not just a draft, but a complete chapter, everything like 20 pages or something, and then realize that it just doesn't work in the whole book. And there were just entire chapters that I literally just tossed out. Sometimes certainly weeks of work, sometimes months and months of work. So it's it was very difficult. And so I don't work with, I do script, I have sort of an outline, and then I script scenes, but it often changes as I'm going along, because the images work with the text, and then sometimes you sort of change things as you're going along.
Okay, for people who are unfamiliar with comics labor, how long would it take you to draw, say, a page of 6 panels?
I know this sounds really long, but it would take about 5 days. But that's everything. That's sort of like the penciling, the inking, which is done on paper, the old method, and then that's scanned in, and then all the color is actually done on the computer. So the production work, which is the color, everything would be 5 days. 5 days, yes.
And then one of the things I said to you earlier is I love the size of the book. I like a small, firm book. But do you work at the scale, or do you work in a giant scale?
It's essentially double the size. So they're large sheets, and everything gets reduced about 50%.
And while we're talking about your drawing, if you flip through the book, Chris's style is just, and I mean this in the best way, it's so charming. And it's the most adorable VW bug I've ever seen in comics. Appears as the crime vehicle. And your caricatures and your faces, they lend this, like as I said, an absolute charm to it, and it makes it a really pleasurable reading experience for some events that maybe are not that pleasurable to actually think about. But can you tell us a bit about your drawing style, maybe your influences, or one thing that I noticed is Chris's lines are all squiggly, even the panel borders. You don't use a ruler. They've all got a little squiggle to them.
It's all freehand.
Yeah, so it really emphasizes that it's freehand. But can you tell us a bit about how you developed as an artist and how you came to this style?
Yeah, it's hard to say because, you know, for many years while I was working in drawing quarterly full time, I would say there would be, I know there was a stretch of at least 7 or 8 years where I didn't draw at all, not even like little doodles at all. And then I would sort of start drawing a little bit here and there. So it actually took a long time to sort of slowly develop that. I wanted to when I had the idea to work on this book, I wanted to do a book before this so that I can get all my mistakes out. And that was that first book, The Manufacturer. And so finally, I thought, okay, now I think I'm ready to do this book. And in terms of influences, working at Drawing Quarterly, I did incredible cartoonists from the very beginning right up until today, years after I stepped down. Honestly, like the best cartoonists, not just in Canada, but in the world. So there were incredible influences on me.
Do you have any formal training as an artist or illustrator?
No, well, I mean, I don't even know, I never considered it as training, but I did live in New York for a couple of years, and I went to a school called the Art Students League. And, yeah, that was about it.
Okay. And then before we open it up to everyone else, I'll just ask about volume 2. So it's in the works, and it will take us to the October crisis.
Yes.
And what will be the publication date, do you think?
Well, this one took me 6 years to do, so it seems like I don't know. I wish I could do it faster, but it looks like I'm stuck with at least another 6 years.
Okay. And do you think that the kind of tone will be similar in terms of the absurdity of it and the behind the scenes things that you uncovered?
Yeah, it's a fact. I mean, obviously the whole October crisis, it's a fascinating story. And there's much more to it than what people know. I mean, what people know tends to be this 2-week period of what happened, but things that happened like in the months leading up to that, and also in the months afterwards. So again, I'm very excited to start working on that in earnest, because it's a fabulous story.
I think we are all already excited for it. So we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, and I think Mylène is going to have a mic so that people online can hear questions, or I could repeat the question. So who would like to ask Chris a question?
I know it's early days still, but you've just recently launched the book, but I'm wondering if you've noticed in the interviews that you've done with either Radio-Canada or the French press in Quebec, if you've noticed a difference in how they approach the book or the kinds of questions that they ask you. If there's, I was surprised to hear, I mean, I know about the FAQ, but I was sort of surprised to hear about maybe the emphasis on the bumbling or the absurdity and stuff like that. I find really interesting, and I look forward to reading the book. But I wonder if that's something that they've picked up on, or just wondering if you've noticed differences between French and English media approaches.
Yeah, it's hard to say because it's still the early days. So I did a launch, as you mentioned, and then I did an interview on Radio-Canada, but there hasn't been a whole lot aside from that. So I think most of the questioning is similar to the English questions. There's a couple that I tend to be asked is like, usually having to do with being an Anglophone, like as an Anglophone, why are you doing this? Or not accusing me of anything, but just sort of like more inquisitive, like, oh, you're interested in this? Oh, like tell us more. You tell us why. So yeah, so that's it. Other than that, I think it is fairly similar so far.
I think we have. Do you still have a question?
Yes. Thank you very much. It's very interesting to discover your work and also the book. So as it was mentioned, I am fluent in reading it. I just have a question about the research that you conducted, and if you discussed with any members that are still alive or with their descendants or any any people that were around this event. And also I was wondering if there is any, any particular information in the Anglophone media that you researched about the Francophone, and if the interview with the lady, the wife of this people, was also published in a Francophone magazine, or just in the
Yeah, so the first part of your question, I didn't approach any of the figures in the FLQ. Many of them have been dying in recent years, while just 3 have died this year alone. I didn't approach the figures mostly for the reason that, for practical reasons. I just figured that if I tried to, there's no way they would want to talk to me. Why would they want to talk to me? So, what would I say? I've worked at a comics publisher for 25 years. I'm doing a book on the FLQ. Can you tell me about your experiences? So I don't think, and I'm an Anglophone too, so they probably would.
And it will be a comic.
And it'll be a comic, yes. Yeah, so I had all these strikes against me. But it is interesting because living in Montreal, you do actually see some of these people. I didn't see former FLQ members, but I would see one person in the book. His name was Claude Ryan. He was a very important figure in Canadian Quebec politics. I used to see him like in our neighborhood. Another Quebec politician I used to see all the time. So I would see these people all the time, but I just figured that I would not be able to approach them. And in terms of, I think the second part of your question was,
the interview with Jean Shooters was published in French.
Yeah, that was actually published in English, and but in general, I think you were asking about was I finding some things are different from the French media compared to English media? I mean, sometimes there were differences, but I for the most part they covered it. It was written about more in general, in French. There were more books published, and with the exceptions being that Jean Shooter's article, which was this incredibly important article, that was in English. So yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Sorry, I have another research question.
Sure.
It's already been broached in terms of the visual research you did, especially going to locations and whatnot. And I was just curious, you get a lot of visual information from the newspaper research that you did, the magazine research, but I was wondering if film and television played into it at all. Was the Archives of Radio Canada helpful, or the NFB, just in terms of getting even the visual information that you needed in order to draw the piece?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of everything. I think probably the majority would have been from newspapers. Some of the books published would all, how in books sometimes would have a section in the middle on glossy paper and there would be photos. Some of those photos were never appeared online anywhere, so sometimes from that. Sometimes from films. A couple of the slides from this presentation were actually screenshots from films. I would run the film and then I would take the screenshot, and that's how it is there. So, and then a lot, because most of the stuff happened about 10 to 15 minutes in either direction from where I live. Like I literally can hop on my bike, go 10 minutes in either direction, and I would find these places. So it was very, all of this was very accessible for me. And so I also took a lot of reference photos.
One more question?
I'm wondering what your favorite part of the book to draw was.
Oh, that's a good question. Let me see. I'll say off the top of my head, in the second chapter, the guerrilla army training camp. So I sort of have this sort of fantasy section of what he dreamed his camp would be, like with thousands of soldiers. So I don't draw thousands of soldiers, but I draw like, I don't know, dozens and dozens and dozens of soldiers. And the camp is growing and growing and growing until they become an actual army. That was probably my favorite.
Why?
I think it was fun to draw like all these soldiers out in the woods. And there's one scene where they're in like in the winter time. So yeah, it was fun.
We have time for one more question. Do you have one at the back? Over here. Yeah, we can do two.
Thank you for your time. I enjoyed the book, and I was wondering, you said I haven't had the chance to read the envelope manufacturer yet, but you said you wanted to do a book before this one to sort of get your mistakes up. I was wondering if there were any particular lessons that you learned from doing that one that you were like, oh, I'm glad I caught that before I moved on to this one.
I don't know if there's something specific in it. It just in general, I think most authors, I know most cartoonists usually sort of disown their first work, and that's sort of the case with me, that I just don't like that book. Just in general, I'm really glad I did another book before doing this one, because my heart was really in this one, and so I'm glad I can get all that stuff out and just learn in general. Again, I don't have a specific thing that I can cite, but yeah.
And one more question.
As a Quebecer, does independence still have much allure for Quebec-born?
It ebbs and flows. It ebbs and flows. I think for many years it was going lower, and in recent years, perhaps recent months, it seems to be sort of on the increase again. Just last week, the Parti Québécois released a budget of year one referring to the first year of Quebec as a country. So I mean, it's always there. But one important thing to note, and I'm not sure if everyone, I'm not sure if this is obvious, but the FLQ, meaning the terrorist element of separatism, was completely different from the political element. I think maybe perhaps younger generations might sort of confuse the two, but once the FLQ met their demise in 1970, the political element, the Parti Québécois, led by René Lévesque, essentially flourished after that.
Okay, I think we are out of time, so please join me in thanking Chris for a fantastic presentation. And he will be signing copies of the book. Where will that be?
We will escort Chris over to the signing table. It's right by the cash desk. So yeah, we'll ask you to stay seated for a moment while he settles in. And yeah, I wanted to also thank you, Chris Oliveros. We've got Candida Rifkind with us. Thank you to Drawing Quarterly, and for all of your attention and questions tonight. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to add, also, it's really great to be in Winnipeg. This is my first time ever in Winnipeg. And it's meaningful to me because my mother is from here. She left when she was about 16 or 17, lives in Ontario now, but I've never been in Winnipeg up until now. So yeah, I've always wanted to come here. So thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks. I know this street. I know this street. Probably. Yes. It's on the way.
That's why I'm so happy.